Squats are such a daunting exercise when you execute it every single time in a different way. You need to have a really systemized process about how you go about squatting. What this is going to do for you as a lifter is clear up the process around how you execute your squats. It means you're going to put more weight on the bar. It means that you're going to be able to do more sets and more reps over time to get more out of the actual exercise itself. Now, the kicker here is anyone that's been training for a long period of time knows that your progress is directly related to your ability to not run into an obstacle, such as pain or constantly missing a lift at the same point over and over again. And you know, I've been in this industry for going on 15 years now, working with strength-based athletes. And I can tell you right now that squatting is less about cueing. Squatting is more about understanding where you need to be in space. When you understand where you need to be in space, it's very easy to align yourself and then get your technique points on top of it. Because if you're just throwing random cues into the air and hope that it's going to stick, hope that it's going to then make your process and your system better, it's really looking at things from a small lens. What we want to do is zoom out a little bit. We want to look at it from a bigger picture and go, what needs to be true in order for me to squat in a repeatable way time and time again? What needs to be true? And when you understand that as a lifter, as a coach, as an athlete, it makes it very easy to systemize the way that you do things and do things consistently, time and time again. Now, in today's video, what we're going to go through is we're going to go through the simple components of squatting that's going to clear up 90% of what you do in the gym. And I'm going to give you some real practical tips that you can implement into your training, whether you use them as warm-up, where you use them in between your actual squatting sets, that's going to help to give you an understanding of where you need to be in space so that then you can get into the optimal position. Because there's nothing worse than working underneath a threshold that you can, purely because you don't know what to do. So let's get into it. The main linchpin that you need to look at with squatting is starting in a stable and effective position. Often, this is the point that gets completely poorly executed, and it means from word go, you're not in the right position. So the way you start any exercise is essentially the way that it's going to go throughout. So with squatting, we have a weight that's literally crushing us down on our back, trying to push us out of position. And our goal is to organize ourselves in a way that can withstand the weight that's on our back. And that all comes back to how you set your torso position and your hip position. Now, there's two big fault points here. One of them is being with your hips way too far under you. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a second. And what that means is it just feeds into the front of your foot and it feeds into your knee. You don't get all that control from your hip. And the second is actually being too far back, sitting back onto your heels, and that puts you in this weird, awkward position where you do this like good morning squat out of the hole. So I'm going to run through what that looks like. I'm going to show you how to clean it up. We can obviously break this out a little bit more, but we're going to start off simple and we can build some layers onto it through the video. Now, Joe's going to jump in and walk out. Now, the first thing that you'll notice here is as he walks out, he's going to get a hip hinge. He's going to sit back with a slight forward lean of his torso, which sets him in a position where his hips are loaded up and he can actually create tension to control him down into the hole. And what you'll notice here as well is you can see that his knees are nice and straight. They're locked out, which means that as he executes his squat, he's going to be able to break evenly, which means he's going to be able to break at the hip and at the knee at the same time. Often what happens is, say Joe's hips go way too far through, in that position, you can see how he's sort of soft in the knee. And if he was to squat here, just do like a quarter squat, see how knee driven that is? That is not a really strong and stable position to say withstand a 200 kilo squat. But if he sits back into his hip a little bit, he's got his knees locked on. In this position here, if he was to do a squat, you can see that he gets that even loading from his hip and his knee, which is a really strong and stable position to do a squat repeatedly, time and time again. Now, where this goes wrong is often people will set the hinge. Do you need a moment? Are you good? No, it's okay. People will often set the hinge and say, for instance, I said, Joe, push your hips back. Often what happens is they overextend through the lower back here. And you can see there, now that just loads up his lumbar spine and it loads up his hips. So this defeats the purpose of the hip hinge because he's missing his hip entirely. Now, the other side of this is if I was to say, Joe, tuck your hips under, Often people really flex out at the spine thinking that that's stacking them neutral, but that's a really poor position for his lower back. His back's flexed, his knees are soft. If he was to squat, he's just feeding into his knees on a flexed back position. So this position isn't strong at all. So what we need to be able to do is straighten the knees out, find the pressure on your foot that's mid-foot, and sit back into your hips slightly. Now in that position, once you're set, you hold that. Imagine we slice him straight through, straight at the pelvis. Then from there, nothing happens below that line. And then he goes with a big exhale, pushes his rib cage down, and that creates his center stack. Now from there, I'm gonna get Joe just to do 3 reps. And this is how it looks like when you were stacked well in a neutral position. You get that even loading between the knee, the hip, and you stay really nice and centered. And you can see the way he starts his squat is the way that he finishes. And this is the first point to a good squat. So the next big linchpin is how you hold weight on your foot, essentially mid-foot pressure, and how you actively descend into the squat itself. Now, if you're thinking about your foot, there's different trains of thought around how you create pressure, how you create torque through your foot. But I want to simplify this down a little bit. If you're too far onto your toes, it means that you're basically sitting onto your toes, and say Joe was to do a squat here, it really feeds into all of your weight being too far forward and feeding into a really knee dominant squat. Now for quad growth, that might be good. For strength, it's not. Now, if he was also too far back on his heels, what that means is as he goes down into the squat, he's going to be unbalanced. So as a result, you can already see there that he's going to have to tip his torso forward in order to get this seesaw motion going on, where he balances out the weight that's on his back and where the weight is in his foot. So a drill that I would get you to play around with in your warm-up is rocking onto your toes, rocking onto your heels, and then coming back to a midpoint. Now, if we think of that midpoint, and then we action the cues from the step 1 of the hips leaning back, the torso leaning forward, that is a really good squat position. You're balanced on your foot. It's the only connection point with the floor. The only connection point with the floor. So you want to make sure that you've got a very, very solid base. And then from the ground up, you want to make sure that everything's stacked in a line. So I'm going to get Joe to jump in now and show what that looks like. Now I'm actually going to get him to run through rocking onto his toes and rocking onto his heels. I'm not going to get him to squat that way because it's quite dangerous. But you can see there that if he rocks onto his toes, his whole weight shifts forward. If he goes too far back, he then instantly leans his torso quite far forward just to be able to balance the weight out. You don't want to have a situation where you're balancing anything. You want to be in the optimal stacked position all the time. So in this position, once you're set, you feel the midfoot pressure and you've set your hinge. Something to consider, I'm going to get Joe to do a couple of squats now, but instead of dive bombing into the hole, thinking about actively pulling himself down into the hole. Because if you dive bomb and bounce into the hole, you're hoping that you get your timing and your momentum right. For me, that's a variable that I want to remove. And you can rack that up there, that's great. I want to make sure that when I'm under a squat, I control every single variable. So part of that is actively pulling yourself into a descend rather than hoping that you get the timing right. Remove that variable completely, because then you'll often find when people get the timing wrong, the hips lift, or they shift weight forward, or they miss a lift at the bottom of the squat on strength, which is such a waste of effort. So get your balance point on your midfoot and then think about actually descending into a squat by pulling, not dive bombing. Now, the next big linchpin is how you hold and create tension into the barbell that's on your back. Now, it's often not that spoken about. You have something that's trying to crush you, literally. So you have to stack and organize yourself in a way that keeps constant pressure against the bar. Makes sense, right? Now, there's a good way and a not so good way of thinking about it. Often the cue that we hear is chest up. Keep chest up because it keeps you more upright. But the issue with that is, if I get Joe to push his chest up, it just extends to his lower back. So every single thing that we've just ran through in terms of getting the balance point, setting the midfoot pressure, getting a hip hinge, just goes away as soon as you drive your chest up. Now I'm gonna get Joe to get underneath the bar here, jump in and walk it out. But what you want to start to think about is the bar's pressing down onto your back. And you're matching that pressure by constantly keeping pressure up into that bar. Now, I often say to my clients, be a meerkat. And it doesn't mean extend, it just means keeping tall, keeping pressure up into the bar. It's not an afterthought. So I'm gonna get Joe to do 3 reps here. On the descend, he's actively keeping tension up into the bar as well. So it's not an afterthought or a passive process. You need to build the tension up into the bar so that you don't get thrown out of position at the lower body and then can maintain that position throughout the squat. So think tall, head to roof without overextension. And if you lock that in with your midfoot pressure, your balance point, and your hips, you're in such a stable position to squat. Now, when we start to talk about neutral spine and being stacked, sometimes we need a few awareness drills to sort of just understand where we are in space. It's not something that comes intuitively to us. We actually need to train for it and understand how to get there. Now, this drill here is really, really effective just to give you a little bit of feedback because you've got the wall behind you and you've also got the seat. So you're not actually having to work that hard. Now, in this position, I'm gonna get Joe to arch his back really, really hard. And you can see there, that's a position that we don't want to squat in. It's what we call anteriorly rotated. It means he just loads up his back, he loads up the front of his hips. Now I'm gonna get him to go the polar opposite of that as well. Really tuck under, and you can see there that it flexes down his spine and actually rounds out his lower back a little bit. Again, not that strong of a position to lift in. So we're gonna find what a happy medium is here for him, and that is what we would call neutral. Now to add a layer to that, how we actually create a brace, I would actually get Joe to get a big breath in and then exhale really, really hard. And as he exhales, he'll feel his abs come on. Now that is the type of tension that we need in the midsection. As you walk out, separate hip hinge, that's the type of position that we need in order to maintain that stacking throughout a squat. Now, I'm not gonna talk about breathing and bracing right now because that is a huge topic in itself. But this would set him in a neutral position and get him in a position where he's not gonna run into impingement type issues at the hip, and he's gonna run into a really good situation where he can consistently squat time and time again without running into bony blocks, which is a really big linchpin here. So give that a go if you haven't done any positional drills. Back tension and maintaining stiffness is something that we actually need to train for. It's not something that comes intuitively, and it's not easy to do. It's actually quite an uncomfortable position to hold and maintain. And often when you think of back tension, we just kind of think about squeezing our shoulder blades together, but it's a lot more than that. We really need to get the entire back working together. We need to get the scaps involved. We also need to get some thoracic extension through the actual rib cage itself, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't drive us into extension because then we lose our position and everything that we've worked towards. So this is a very simple drill here, but I'm gonna get Joe to do a band pull apart with an isometric hold at the end. Now, do it as if you have no ab tension at all and you extend. That is what we'll typically see happen. We see this really overextended position where his rib cages flare up. Now, that position there is not really gonna carry over to what a squat position looks like. So what I'll get Joe to do is drive his rib cage down and then re-tighten his back by pulling that band apart. Now that position there is actually very hard to do. It's quite uncomfortable. And if you hold that, you think of a training set. If you have to do a set of 6, a set of 8, you might be squatting for 30 seconds. So you also need to build up the ability of 1, an understanding of how to hold that position, 2, where your fatigue point is, and then 3, it gives you enough time and opportunity to continue to refine it. Because you can drop that down now. Because when you get under a bar, you go into survival mode. So you need to be able to do these types of actions under lighter loads without the presence of weight on your back. So this is a perfect drill and opportunity to really start to fire up those patterns. Now, the time has come that we need to put some weight on our back. So I'm gonna get Joe to run through a drill that gives you a bit of a feedback of what it's like to squat with a bar on your back. And then we can work on the components of where the pelvis is, how you create pressure into the bar, and then more importantly, how you maintain pressure on your foot. So Joe's gonna jump under here, he's gonna walk it out, and he's gonna set it up exactly how he's going to squat. So he's got that slight hip hinge back, he's got a slight inclination of his torso forward, and he's sitting on a really nice balanced midfoot. Now from here, I'm gonna get him to start off by overextending and arching his lower back. Probably feels terrible. Then I'm gonna get him to do the opposite, tuck right under. Now I'm gonna get him to find a midpoint, That's a strong and stable position, and I'm gonna get him to squat down by a third. Now, we're gonna repeat that process again. I'm gonna get Joe to tuck his hips under. Terrible position for squatting, and then do the opposite, extending. Now we wanna find the midpoint. Then I'm gonna get him to come down a little bit further, and we're gonna repeat that again. Now from here, extend. Terrible, there's no room to go. Tuck under, probably feels absolutely terrible, and then back to the center point. Now from here, I'm gonna get him to stand up, find neutral, find his hinge, keep the pressure into the bar, and do 3 reps in that stacked position. And you can see here, the feedback that he's gotten from the drills and his understanding of where he needs to be in space now makes for a very consistent squat where he's going to be able to execute it time and time again. Now, a big consideration with this as well is it's harder and harder to maintain these positions as the weight gets heavier or as the fatigue creeps up. So it's something that you don't just set and forget. It's something that you consciously need to work towards every time you squat. You need to go through your process in a systemized way so that you don't miss steps. Over time, obviously, you get better at it and becomes a bit more of a process that's natural, but you really need to go through it in a really robotic manner in order to dial in all the components, because it's something that doesn't come natural to us and we need to train. When it comes to squatting, actually most of the big compound lifts, you're gonna fail first on skill and positioning. You're not gonna fail on muscular fatigue or your desire to do a rep. You're gonna fail because you can't maintain the position that you need to be in that's strong, stable, and efficient. So when we have a look at the squatting points that I've just ran through, if you can get your ducks lined up where you go through a very similar process every single time, it means that you're gonna be able to get consistent results in training, minimize the risk of injuries or running into niggles along the way, and it means that you're going to be able to make more progress year on year, which ultimately should be the goal for every single person training. The amount of 1RM squats and heavy squats that I've seen, and I can tell you right now that most of them fail because they change their process as they go to set up for these main lifts. So say for instance, I've never hit a 1RM squat before and I go to do it and I've been doing sets of 5, sets of 6, sets of 7, and I go to execute that 1RM. In most cases, where it goes wrong is people change their process, and it means that they don't actually get the ability or the option to express their strength because they just miss on a process. It's never ability in terms of strength, it's always positioning. So if you follow these, they're gonna definitely help you out in your squats. Below, I have a link to my newsletter. Jump on that because you'll get first-hand information for the best way for you to execute your training and your rehabilitation and make sure that you get long-term training results that last. Remove the guesswork and start training in a systemized, process-driven way.